today we will cover a little bit of background of Fund the People and also the Talent Justice Initiative. Then we'll be talking about the Talent Justice Access Research and findings. Then we'll pause for a brief Q&A. Then we'll turn to the Talent Justice Toolkit, and particularly 3 tools with resources to help both funders and nonprofits to create more equitable on-ramps to nonprofit careers and the nonprofit workforce. Then we'll hear from the Red Hook Initiative about how they are working to create these equitable on-ramps for the people in their local community in Brooklyn, New York. Then we'll have time for some more Q&A, and then we'll share some resources, upcoming activities, and then we will wrap up. So Fund the People, we're the national campaign to maximize investment in the nonprofit workforce. We exist in order to help address chronic and systemic deficit of investment in the nonprofit workforce. And we believe that in order to build a strong and equitable and sustainable nonprofit workforce, that we need increased investment in nonprofit professionals and organizations and the overall nonprofit workforce. Here you see our advisory council, which we work in partnership in order to build a movement to better invest in nonprofit people and nonprofit organizations and the workforce. I'd like to briefly acknowledge Rusty Stahl, who's our president and CEO, and a few advisory council members that are joining us on today's webinar. So 2 core principles that guide Fund the People's work is that the workforce is the most important asset for nonprofit performance and impact and sustainability, and also that equity and inclusion are central to building a strong nonprofit workforce. And talent justice is the logical result of these principles. So in this slide, you see that the current lack of investment is creating a bottleneck on the nonprofit leadership highway, and that this is inequitable in terms of getting access to the field, advancing within the sector, and ascending into executive leadership. So just a quick snapshot, you'll see that, you know, that executive transitions and setting up people of color to fail creates this jam in terms of people stuck at their off-ramps. And then there's also people caught in traffic, there's burnout, unequally distributed mentorship, lack of savings and debt support. And then there's people stuck at the on-ramps, which is what we're talking about today, with unpaid internships, low-wage entry-level positions, and also lack of career supports. And there's also a major challenge for organizational effectiveness and equity. So we see talent investing as a social justice issue and an equity issue within our field. But as we invest in our people, we need to be intentional about addressing issues of equity and inclusion. And that's why we launched the Talent Justice Initiative. Funders and nonprofits, we believe, need to intentionally, substantially, and continuously invest in nonprofit professionals. And also that talent investing can and must advance both effectiveness and equity. So here, you see them both coming together and with the Talent Justice Initiative. So just some quick definitions about what is talent justice and also what is talent investing. So basically, talent justice, you know, is all about practices that utilize investments in nonprofit staff to advance intersectional racial equity across the nonprofit career life cycle. And talent investing is the intentional deployment of resources to support and develop professionals and leaders in the nonprofit workforce. And here I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the funders that have supported our work and the Talent Justice Initiative. And here are our colleague organizations that I'd like to acknowledge who've been hard at work to advance racial equity in the social sector. And then last but not least, a special thank you to our Talent Justice Survey distribution partners for getting the survey out to their networks and making sure that we had a robust response to the survey. So now I'm excited to introduce you to our our presenters. And first up is Sasanka Jinadasa, and she serves as the Center for Urban and Racial Equity's Manager of Equity Strategy and Training. And in this role, Sasanka develops and facilitates racial equity, organizational change strategies, trainings, and dialogues. And she's an advocate and educator working to end oppression and criminalization of people who experience social stigma and state violence. Sasanka's work centers Black and Brown people, queer and trans people, women, and femmes. Prior to consulting, Sasanka served as the Community Engagement and Technical Assistance Manager at HIPS, where they trained individuals and communities on sex work, drug use, harm reduction, and gender. Sasanka graduated from Harvard University with a bachelor's in women, gender, and sexuality with a concentration in African American studies. I'm also excited to introduce you to Joe Eisenhard, who's the founder and executive director of the Red Hook Initiative. So the Red Hook Initiative is based in Brooklyn, New York. Since 2002, RHI has developed a model for social change and youth development that empowers youth and community members to become agents of change in their own lives and within their own neighborhood. Jill has over 20 years of direct youth work experience with a community-based social justice lens. Formerly a program implementation manager with the Carrera Team Pregnancy Prevention Program at Children's Aid Society. Jill is a graduate of the Choral Leadership New York program. In 2014, Jill was named Crane's 40 Under 40 and was a City and State Above and Beyond honoree in 2016. Jill holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Cornell University. So now, before we get into today's presentation, just briefly about today's topic. The Talent Justice Initiative, as I mentioned earlier, is all about helping funders and nonprofits to invest in intersectional racial equity across the nonprofit workforce and across the career life cycle of people of color, women, young people, and other diverse constituencies. Our launch webinar that happened last month discussed the key findings and recommendations of our Talent Justice Report. But on today's webinar, we'll explore the issue of access to nonprofit careers, the nonprofit workforce, and how as nonprofits and funders we can build more equitable on-ramps for people seeking to enter this field. Now I'll turn it over to Sasanka.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. I'm really excited to be here. We're excited to be here. I'm with the Center for Urban and Racial Equity, which partners with people and organizations to advance equity through policy, systems, institutions for community and societal change. We do this through a few CURE partners, primarily with organizations to advance community and institutional and societal change. And we do this through a number of different types of programs and available work. We do this through research and analysis, strategic planning and consulting, training, and educational strategies that address systemic barriers to equity and inclusion. And as part of our partnership with Fund the People, we led the Talent Justice Research Study and Development of the Toolkit. And the research study and the toolkit are what I'm primarily going to be talking about today. What we are going to go over these few objectives. You'll hear me talking, you'll hear Jill talking, you'll hear Yolanda asking both of us questions, and there'll be plenty of time for anyone to ask questions throughout the webinar. Like Yolanda said, if you want to just jump in and drop some questions in the chat whenever you have them, there'll be time for Yolanda to synthesize them and ask those questions from me and Jill. So to go over our objectives just really quickly, we're going to illustrate why talent investment is needed early in the talent pipeline to promote racial equity in nonprofit careers. We're going to identify the barriers people of color and other marginalized communities face in accessing the nonprofit sector. And we're going to discuss strategies nonprofits and funders can use to address racial and socioeconomic inequities experienced by people of color and other marginalized communities when entering the nonprofit sector. If you have currently or formerly worked in nonprofits, how did you start? So our poll options were going to be if you had a paid internship, an unpaid internship, a service fellowship, meaning something like AmeriCorps or Vista or Health Corps, a part-time job or a full-time job. And you can drop that in there if you want to, no pressure, but feel welcome to. full-time, part-time, fellowship, paid and unpaid. Yeah, so I'm seeing a really wide range of different types of internships and part-time, full-time jobs. Okay, so I have a question for those of you who worked in an internship or a service position, and again, feel free to answer it if you want to, but did you feel like it paid you enough? Did you feel like your internship or service fellowship paid you enough to survive, if it paid you at all? And you can feel free to drop that in if you would like to. All right. So we, in our talent justice research study, we're thinking about barriers to access. And one of the questions that we asked, yeah, I see that, still waiting for better pay and full-time. I totally hear that. It's definitely something we're going to talk about actually on today's webinar. So one of our big questions is, what are the barriers and what are the ways that people actually access the nonprofit sector and space? And we took a poll and we've broken it down here, as you can see in our survey. We broke it down by white folks versus people of color and how they identified what the main barriers to accessing the nonprofit sector are. And if you can see here that while everyone says that low starting salaries are a barrier, people of color say it slightly more than white people do. People of color are significantly more likely to note lacking connections as a barrier to entry in the nonprofit sector. And other significant differences include a lack of recruitment and communities of color, underpaid service fellowships, and high degree requirements. And across the board, people of color are noting higher barriers than white people are. So that's something that we wanted to just pull out of this slide really quickly. And this is sort of where we started to see, right, that talent investment and racial justice are intertwined. People of color, Black and brown folks, Black and Indigenous folks, New Americans, people are reporting more barriers to access when it comes to unpaid and underpaid. I'm actually going to just tweak that New Americans code because I actually don't have that statistic right in front of me. Noting that people of color overall are noting higher barriers to access. We're also seeing some really significant and notable differences when it comes to recruitment, underpayment, and exclusionary job requirements. So with other barriers to access that we're seeing, did I jump right to 16? Yeah. While people of color are supportive of approaches to talent justice that focus on hiring, recruitment, and access, they're generally less enthusiastic that they will be the best ways to advance equitable access in the sector. We see a lot more investment in from people of color in barriers to staying in the nonprofit sector, which we call advancement and retention. So that's something to note, and there's more information on that in the report, and it's also addressed in the toolkit. In this figure, you'll see that in the highest reported needs for increasing access, you'll see that we've broken it down here by foundation investment and nonprofit investment versus needs reported, so what people wanted to see invested in. You'll see that both foundations and nonprofits are not investing at the level that needs are being seen. So while this is true across the board, nonprofits are a lot more likely to invest in hiring people with lived experience than foundations, which is another key access point that we noted earlier. When we asked people where they saw the largest need for investing in increasing access to the sector, the answers were, there were like big differences between nonprofits and foundations. And nonprofits believed that investing in competitive salaries was the most beneficial, while foundations believe that investing in paid fellowships, internships, what we're calling apprenticeships, is the most beneficial. So we are going to have a poll here, and you can feel free to just drop this in the chat box if you want. We don't have any data on this, so we were just curious what you thought. Why do you think that foundations and nonprofits might have a difference in what they see as most valuable in investing in practices that advance equitable access? So when we're talking equitable access, right, like what we think is valuable for more people of color accessing the sector. Why do you think that nonprofits and foundations have really sort of like disparate opinions? And seeing that funders might have like a different background. Maybe a lot of funders are white and wealthy, so maybe they have a different perspective on what is important to be funded. There's a really different makeup of people who work at foundations versus the makeup of people at nonprofits. They have different funding goals. And some people think that foundations see themselves as benevolent donors who know best, and they don't see their own staff as nonprofit staff. That's really interesting. This sort of idea that funders and nonprofits, that funders don't really see themselves as being part of the nonprofit space. And sometimes they are, right? Sometimes funders are C3s, so that's interesting. Not typically having internal conversations about how power is held within their institutions and by whom, further removed from the communities they aim to serve. Really interesting. Yeah, I think these are all really interesting perspectives, and we have some suggestions on how we can sort of address some of these issues. And I think it's really interesting, this sort of idea about what funders being more distant from the programs and clients when we're talking about how they're investing in their staff and how that might affect their perspective as well. That's really interesting. Thank you all so much. So what we're going to do now is turn it over to Jill, who is our discussant for the day. And we're going to talk about how this affects like sort of your work, Jill, and what you see as valuable and important and what you've pulled out of the research findings as they've been presented to today.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here today and to be talking about this in this space. And definitely have some reflections from what we are seeing on the ground here in Brooklyn, and could offer some of those. So I think some of the things that jumped out to me in looking at this that really feel like it's resonating with us here in Red Hook, the data about staff, and particularly people of color, people who may be coming from low-income backgrounds or the communities that we're serving here, often we do find the lack of connection to a broader network as being a challenge. And that when you think about moving on or growing or moving from part-time into full-time, often having that network of people to talk to beyond your immediate team is really important. And so that's something that we have put some thinking into, and I'll share a little bit about that later, but that really was something that resonated. Another piece that comes out of the findings, and I think is a real place where you can notice the difference between funders and funder approaches and a nonprofit who's working in this area, we'll often find that when we're applying for funding for a new program or expanding a position, a funder is asking us to submit a resume or to submit qualifications, or they'll want to know the person who's going to fill a role or what degree that they have. And when that is happening, I think nonprofits, especially who don't have a lot of resources or fallback space, it can be, you can really question if we put forward the person who we want or the person who we think would be best for this, who might be someone who is from a community being served, who doesn't necessarily have the degree that a foundation might be looking for, you really wonder, are we then putting ourselves in jeopardy of not getting the funding? And so I think a space to look there is, what are funders asking for as far as resumes, requirements? Where can nonprofits feel like they can say, we believe that we know who we need to do this work, and we value lived experience, we value local expertise, we value something that might be a different value that would be held by the foundations. I think that's a real point of tension, so that even if nonprofits are wanting to move in the direction of valuing lived experience over a certain degree, they might hesitate to move forward with that, wondering if they would get the funding. And another thing I think that jumps out is just looking at the packages that nonprofits are able to put forward, especially smaller nonprofits. Like our organization is 17 years old, and our board is only now just saying we have to make the strategic investment and try to come up with the funding to think about retirement packages for all staff at all levels. We don't offer anything for anyone right now, and to look at growth opportunities, oftentimes, particularly for nonprofits that have primarily government funding, I think it can be really challenging for organizations to figure out, well, where would what is perceived as extra funding that's anything beyond the bare bones, where would that come in? And for funders to recognize this is about a bigger picture. It's about making sure that a nonprofit career can be someone's career for life, that they could do that and still be putting something toward retirement, having positive opportunities, thinking about what is offered for healthcare or benefits that isn't always an easily funded investment, I think, on the foundation side.
Jill, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives.
Yes, and I'm glad to offer more as we move along.
So now we're going to turn it back over to Sasanka to keep us going and talk to us about some of the resources in the Talent Justice Toolkit, particularly around the three access findings in the talent justice research.
Yeah, excellent. So we have 3 tools that focus specifically on access to the sector. And one of them is on eliminating bias in hiring. It actually addresses a couple other things, but the part that specifically focuses on access is on hiring. And so we've sort of pulled out these 3 parts during hiring in which bias can creep in, whether intentional or not. One of them is in requirements. So we had already talked a little bit. Can you all hear me? Sorry. One of the things that we'd already talked about, right, is degree requirements. So a degree might be one way that we allow bias into our space, into our hiring space. Another space that we see that is in recruitment, right? So who are we recruiting from? Where are we recruiting? Are we primarily recruiting at certain colleges, or are we primarily recruiting in certain communities? And how can we address that? And another space where there can be bias in hiring is in review. So when we actually get the applications in, if somebody has met the requirements and they've been recruited, or despite not being recruited, they found the position somehow and they've applied, or maybe they didn't have the requirements and they applied anyway, how are they being assessed in review? And that's another space where we saw potential for bias. So that could look like, do we focus on things like typos, or without recognizing the inequity in who has either money or time to get their resumes sent out for review, for example. So that's one way that we see bias potentially creeping up in hiring. Next slide, please. Awesome. So there's a lot of different overlaps in the types of bias that are popping up here, right? So one that we saw was a lack of access to social or economic capital. That could mean, right, like having the connections to get your resume put to the front of the pile. It could mean having a university name that people recognize. Those sorts of things can be increase the bias that you experience in the hiring process. Another is an organizational lack of structural racism analysis. So we note this because some of these bias indicators might be alleviated, especially if your organization or your staff have been through some sort of structural racism training and know and are able to implement an analysis that's rooted in addressing structural racism. So if your organization doesn't have that analysis, they're more likely to see bias creep up in both implicit and explicit ways. And the third one that we wanted to pull out is more focused on cultural norms, right? So there are several assumed cultural norms in the hiring process. One example is thank you notes. Like, it's an assumed knowledge that people know to send thank you notes at the end of the job interview. And there's been a lot of work that's been cropping up throughout people who do this kind of work in the sector to say, like, a lot of people don't know that you're supposed to do things like send thank you notes at the end of an interview. And that's an assumed norm that's sort of based in a more corporate or a white dominant structure that is flowing into bias in the sector. So we wanted to ask, have any of you seen these sorts of biases like pop up in your, whether it's your organization that you work at currently, or have you seen any of these types of biases show up, whether it's applicants not being able to access because of recruitment? Does your organization like focus on things like typos, or whether or not people send in a thank you letter? And I'm going to keep moving, but feel free to share them in the chat box, and so we can see if you are seeing those practices. And if you are seeing those practices, have you thought about them as biased before? Do you feel like your organization is working to change them, but they're running up against structural barriers? So something I've talked to some nonprofits about is they're like, well, our funder says that it's required that we have higher education requirements for job positions. If they're going to fund it, they want that person to have a master's degree. So what are the barriers you're seeing in being able to address some of these biases? I'm seeing that recruitment is one of the big challenges. So we have some strategies in our, if we move to the next slide, in our toolkit, but I'll just share a couple with you right now. And again, I recommend for the toolkit because it goes into a lot more detail. Yeah, there you go. So, I mean, I want to note that all of these strategies without a structural analysis can still be weaponized against people of color. So one thing that we advocate for is like standardization of practices in review, so that when you are reviewing someone's resume, or like you're reviewing their cover letters, that like everyone's sort of kind of getting the same treatment, and that you have qualitative and quantitative metrics. When you have those metrics, you want to make sure that you also do an equity review. So let's say at the end of your review process, you've noticed that all the people of color have been sorted out and all the people who've come to the top of your pile are white. It's worth doing an equity review of your process to see like why that keeps happening, especially if it happens multiple times. Another thing we recommend is racial equity training to bring you up on that structural racism analysis, so that you can start to see those biases crop up through your own analysis, as opposed to hiring, like consultants to like just tell you what's wrong with it. You want to build up that like equity muscle within your organization. And then for recruitment, which is something that I see people say a lot, is to build meaningful relationships with organizations that are led by people of color and have strong community ties. I've even recommended in the past that you actually contract and compensate organizations for doing recruitment on your behalf, right? You want to really build those community ties in a way that's meaningful between your organizations, so that it's not like this organization or this community is doing recruitment on your behalf without your organization showing investment in communities of color in the first place. That is sort of our bias in hiring tool. So then another tool that we have is how to make a more equitable apprenticeship. And so you'll hear us use this term quite a bit throughout the toolkit and throughout this presentation, but we're talking about apprenticeships as sort of like an umbrella term for experiences that don't offer like permanent job stability and are sort of often undercompensated or uncompensated entirely, like Service Corps fellowships like AmeriCorps and VISTA fellowships, or internship programs, whether it's through universities or not. We're seeing in the next slide lots of disparities and inequities there, right? Biased recruitment. So recruitment for internships and Service Corps fellowships in particular are usually almost inherently biased towards people who already have higher education, right? Because a lot of that recruitment is happening at the college level. So you're already restricting a pipeline to people who are already part of a university system. Another thing that we're seeing is the lack of compensation. So for folks who maybe need to have a paid job because they support a family or they don't have some sort of like inherited wealth that allows them to support an unpaid or underpaid internship, you're going to see it a lot more difficult for folks like that to access the sector. And a lot of those folks are people of color. And then, yes, the over-prioritization of higher education is the main thing. And the biased recruitment towards largely white institutions. You know, wealthier colleges also often have more capacity to have like entire public service academies where organizations can recruit from. And that might not be true for universities with less institutional wealth. So some of the strategies that we recommend on the next slide are equitable compensation. So to have the living wage as a floor. Whatever position that you have available, that you pay people at minimum living wage. And this will come up in our third tool as well, which is strategies for overall equitable compensation. We're also talking about that recruitment, that meaningful relationships with organizations led by people of color, organizations that have strong community ties, and to give your apprentices meaningful work so that if they are being underpaid and uncompensated, that they have something that they can show to a potential employer in the future, and that they're not primarily doing work that doesn't improve their skills. So if you look at the next slide, the Department of Labor has a test that they call the primary beneficiary test. And this is a legal test, and it's often used more for for-profit companies. But the idea is that if you are hiring someone in an unpaid capacity as an intern, that they would receive the primary benefits of being at your organization. Because if you receive the primary benefits, then it should go to follow that you would be paying this person as an employee. So this isn't, I'm not a lawyer and I cannot give legal advice. I would prefer not to be sued. So this is just something that we use as a jumping off point, right? So the work that the apprentice does should complement instead of replace the work of paid employees. So let's say your organization went through a restructure and you had to let go of some crucial employees who did crucial work to keep your organization going. Hiring an unpaid intern is not an appropriate use of an intern's time because that would not meet the primary beneficiary test, but also that it would not support the intern in being able to, or apprentice, in being able to access like well-compensated work in the future. I think there was a recent study. I don't have the citation for it, so I will actually hold it until Q&A time so that I can make sure I find the link, but about how unpaid people who have had unpaid internships have a more difficult time finding a job than people who might even have had no internships in the past. So your program should also accommodate external commitments that an apprentice might have, like school or paid work. So your internship or service fellowship should be flexible to the external commitments that someone might have. And you should be very transparent about what someone will get out of the apprenticeship experience. So I've seen a lot of interns, service corps members feel really burned at the end of a fellowship because they felt like they were going to get a job at the nonprofit at the end of the duration of their term. And that's because I think nonprofits end up making a lot of false promises in order to gain this sort of like unpaid, underpaid labor. So being really transparent is really key also to racial equity and talent justice. All right, and then we can go to the next slide. And then the third tool we're going to talk about is salaries. And this is the last tool I'm going to talk about before I turn it over to Jill. And really, as you noted, like nonprofits are really noting that increasing and compensating people at an equitable level is really crucial to access to the sector. And it's really time to bring nonprofit work to a higher standard for employees, particularly for employees working in non-management positions. Like I said earlier, a living wage should be a floor, not a goal. This is like why we are talking about talent justice as part of talent investing, right? Like this is partially on nonprofits to make this a standard, and this is partially on funders to make it possible. So we are really thinking that in order for people of color to better access the sector, we really need to be thinking higher in terms of salaries. Scaling the strategies, make a plan for your donors and your funders, how you're going to get there, how you can use their support, be really clear with them about why you want to increase salaries. So if you go to the next slide, salary increases can be seen as mission fulfillment, especially if you work in economic inequity work and addressing things like paid family leave or economic injustice or racial justice. You really should have salaries that are at least a minimum a living wage. And I think it's important that you make that argument that it's doing that for your staff is part of mission fulfillment. And another argument that you can make is that it makes organizations more effective, less turnover, less sort of, higher talent coming in the door, like people that you couldn't get in the door before, you're going to be able to get in the door, you're going to be able to utilize their talent, they're going to be able to stay for longer in the space, which reduces a lot of that institutional memory loss that nonprofits see a lot. And be very transparent with applicants. Post those salary ranges. Let people know where they're coming in at. Don't try to hide the ball. I think that's a tendency a lot of nonprofits have. They're like, we just got to hook them with the mission, and then they'll come in, and then we'll be like, we know the salary's not what exactly we want. But be transparent right up front so that you don't end up losing a great applicant who sort of like feels like they lost out in that process. And I saw that somebody asked about benefits and PTO. And if you look at our next slide, we do think that benefits, like if you can't offer the salary that you want, and I still think that a living wage should be a floor regardless, but if you can't have much more than a living wage, being creative with benefits is also really important. So we've listed some benefits that we have in the toolkit. So I'm just going to read them out, and then I would love, and we have 2 pages, so wait until I get to the second page. If y'all could drop some other things that you would love to see as benefits that nonprofits offer. So on our first page here, we have health insurance that includes vision and dental with employer-paid premiums. My first job that I ever worked, my nonprofit employer paid all my premiums, and then the second nonprofit job I worked, they didn't, and it made a huge difference to my quality of life. I think that's like a really big one. Generous and flexible paid time off. That's, flexible, right? Like not just structured to like certain times of the year. One way that inequity creeps in with paid time off often is what you see in the third bullet, is that paid time off is often restricted to certain religious and cultural spaces and holidays, usually things like Christmas. I've worked with organizations that always get Good Friday off, for example. Extensive parental leave for the birth parent and other caregivers. The reason that it's important to think about other caregivers is to think about, when we're talking about people of color, we're talking about queer and trans people of color, you want to think about how different family structures are created that might rely on primary caregivers that aren't just the birth parent and the birth parent's primary partner. Other family leave, including bereavement leave. Different cultures have different bereavement practices. So that's another one. If we go to the second page, and I'll just roll through that one really quickly. Retirement plans, life insurance, telecommuting options, remote work options, tuition and professional development, financial assistance, loan forgiveness, repayment support. If you can't support someone with salary, but they have a lot of student loans, this can be a really, really, really important one as well. So we can go to the next slide. What would you like to see included in a nonprofit benefits package? Any benefits package, but what would be really valuable to you? I've been seeing a lot happening in sort of the nonprofit equity space about we don't need a pizza party, we need healthcare. So what else do you need to see? What else is helpful to you? And while you all are dropping that in the comments, we can go to the next slide. So again, we were talking about just drop in the comments what you would love to see in terms of benefits. Transparency is really crucial. And this is a story from our Talent Justice Toolkit. And I won't read the whole thing out. You all can take a look at it. But just reflecting that it's okay if your salary isn't where the salaries you're providing aren't where you want them to be right now. While you're working to get them there, be really clear with your staff about what their actual earning potential is with the org so they can make their own decisions. I think, like I said earlier, sometimes we want to hide the ball, we want to keep people for longer, but we find that the more transparent you are, the more your staff are going to feel supported and cared for, and they know that they can make their own decisions with the most information possible. And you look at the next slide, again, post those salary ranges, be clear about organizational duties in the job description and interviews. I do love that bullet, other duties as assigned, but still we should be as clear as possible what people be expected to do and not add lots and lots of things after they've joined and then they feel like their salary is more inequitable. Be clear about your equity priorities and challenges in the job description interviews. So if you know that your salary is not where you'd like it to be really clear about that. Say, we are working on this, this is our plan. And the plans that you have, share those with potential applicants. This is how we're gonna get to a more equitable salary. This is how we're utilizing this benefits package to make sure that you can have access to as much as you can. This is how we're creatively getting around these different degree requirements, and just transparency. I come from a trauma-informed service background, and it's really important. I think transparency is crucial to actually developing racial equity and bringing people along the journey and not feeling like they're being left behind while you figure out a solution. And with that, please look at the toolkit. It lays it out in a, there's bullets and discussion questions and lots of fun things in there to sort of think about implementing this stuff. And I'll turn it over to Yolanda and Jill.
Thanks, Sasanka. Thanks for walking us through those different resources in the toolkit. And if you take a look at the chat box, you'll see our participants listed several additional ideas for benefits that could be included for nonprofits, professionals that would definitely make this a better opportunity for them. So now I'm excited to bring back Jill, who's going to talk with us a little bit more about the Red Hook Initiative and how their work ties into what we've been talking about in terms of creating equitable on-ramps into nonprofit careers and the nonprofit workforce. So, Jill, can you tell us a little bit about the Red Hook Initiative and also how your organization's racial equity analysis informs your work?
Yes, absolutely. I'm really excited to be here and to share a bit about our work, and I'll move quickly just in the interest of time to try to cover as much as I can. So to give you a quick overview, the Red Hook Initiative is 17 years old. We're a small organization. Our budget is around 4.5 million. We have 35 full-time staff, about 15 part-time staff, and actually, I'm excited to say in one of the earlier survey questions, we have 100 youth from our neighborhood who are actually paid. So someday when someone's asking them their first work experience at a nonprofit, they'll be able to say it was as a teenager and they were paid an hourly wage for their contribution, which is an exciting piece in thinking about this full work. Our organization focuses on 3 things, all with really a lens of racial equity and looking at the community of Red Hook, Brooklyn. It's the 2nd largest public housing development in New York City is in Red Hook. And so there are around 10,000 residents in this neighborhood who are primarily people of color who are living, majority are at or below the poverty level. And so our 3 areas of work really focus on creating systemic change within the neighborhood. And that's done through youth development programming that serve around 500 young people a year through youth programs from 6th grade through age 24. We focus on community building and looking at systemic change. So not just providing direct services, but looking at what's happening around housing, what's happening around access to schools or transportation or health issues in the community. And then our 3rd area is what we'll dive into a little more today, is that we have a priority of hiring residents from the community. And our belief, as going back to like our lens toward racial equity, is that we really believe people from the community are the ones who know what change is needed, and to know how can they provide programs and services and lead the work for their neighbors. And so each year, for the last 5 years, we have paid over $1 million back into the neighborhood through staff salaries to people who are leading the work for their community. and I'll dive into this a little bit more as we talk about the Institute.
Yeah, so that's my next question is, what is the RHI Institute, and also, you know, what you're learning from that experience.
Yeah, so when we first started 17 years ago, we give you just a little bit of history on it. I was a health educator at a local hospital. I started out by hiring 10 women who are all residents of the neighborhood, and we were focused on health. And as we grew over time, we kept that core model of people leading the community, people from the community leading the work. And as we got bigger and had more reliance on government contracts or other funding sources, we started to hire people who were not from the neighborhood. And people started to say, well, wait a minute, is this community-led? What does this actually mean? What does it mean to become a bigger organization? And we said, we do want to keep this at the center. And so in order to do that, we're going to create an internal program that is prioritizing hiring people from the neighborhood and overcoming these barriers. So the Institute was created 2 years ago with a goal. You can see the goals here. It was really about reducing barriers that are rooted in systemic inequities and racism. It's about making sure community members continue to have leadership roles, that young people are able to see role models when they're getting services, and people are seeing people who look like them and who are from their community who are providing what is needed. You can advance to the next slide. And that we're also retaining talent. So I think as we recognize people who are moving up, we're not a huge organization with tons of opportunities to grow. And so one way to help make sure that we were retaining our talented staff was saying, if we can prioritize their professional development and their growth and address some of these bigger barriers that we're seeing, that will be a way to really help invest in our staff. And so we're actually doing it in a way where this is considered a program. It has its own program budget. It has its own outcomes. We try to find funding sources that will do this. It's not just a side pot of money that we look at as like an HR expense. And so these were the goals with the Institute. And we're still continuing to develop it, but there are really three main components. So the first is that we focus on professional development for every staff member who works here, regardless of if you have a declared big goal or not. And that we have this year for the first time, we're investing $25,000 for staff members who have not finished an undergraduate degree, that they could apply either to go back to school, to apply if they're currently in school, to put toward debt if they started college at one point and weren't able to finish because of financial reasons, they could apply to put money toward this debt. So this is a goal of figuring out how we can help to eliminate some of those barriers to a college degree educational attainment for people who are interested in getting that, and finances were a barrier. We also routinely make time that we plan ahead, but we will close our agency in order to focus on professional development and training. So if there's a training that we believe everyone should have access to, we prioritize paying trainers. This past year, we've done a lot of work around therapeutic crisis intervention, motivational interviewing, looking at some crisis response that we've done for all staff, and people can earn certificates in that. And then for leaders, we also looking particularly at middle management and people of color who we believe are rising into leadership positions and have potential, where we'll say, we will send you offsite to trainings, we will make investments in that. Every program within the Red Hook Initiative has a development line to say investing in the growth and development of staff is really important, and people are checking in with their supervisor throughout the year on those goals. That happens across the board. We have two programs that are particular to the Institute. The first is a fellows program. Fellows are from the neighborhood and under the age of 30 and have at least 1 year of work experience and know that they want to have a career, or believe at that stage that they want to have a career in nonprofit development. So those We have now done 2 cycles of fellows. Both times it's been 8 fellows. It's the next slide. And they are paid positions. They're all from the neighborhood. They work 20 hours a week and are contributing to one of the teams here, have clear job descriptions, have a clear supervisor, but they're all connected with an external mentor who's outside of our organization to help them build the network that they will need to move into the nonprofit sector. And they also have regular time focused on a weekly meeting that helps them to better understand the barriers that they might face as young people of color moving into the nonprofit sector. Things like talking about the thank you note and the handshake and the things that people have been putting in the chat box here, and saying like, let's become aware of all of this so that you have what you need to navigate this, because we can't change the system overnight, but we can make sure that you are prepared to participate in the system before the change happens. And we have had a lot of success. The majority of fellows for both years now have ended up in a permanent position with a nonprofit organization, or have ended up getting into college or working toward a degree. And everybody who has participated feels like being part of the fellows program has propelled them further on their career track. And we do have some fellows who've been able to hire into permanent positions, or some who I believe we will be able to hire 4 or 5 years from now, coming in at higher levels because they're out now in the nonprofit sector doing work and learning beyond our community and our walls. Our second program is Career Accelerator, and that is for our permanent staff at the Red Hook Initiative who have a career goal where they know they want to launch ahead in something other than what would just be covered in regular professional development. So they are all connected with external mentors beyond Red Hook Initiative, have access to the scholarship funding, have an individual work plan where they're declared what they want their professional goal to be. You can move to the final Career Accelerator slide, which highlights some of the goals. We're in the middle of the second year, so it still feels like a pilot, but we have found that this has been a great tool for retaining people, or if it wasn't about retention, I think opening up a dialogue where we know someone does want to leave, and like, let's have that be an active conversation about how can we help you with using our networks, connecting your networks to ultimately get ahead. And I think one of the things that happens here is that this is really prioritizing the individual in a few cases, sometimes over the organization. So saying, you know, if you have a goal of going back to school, we are choosing to invest in you, even though that might mean that you're leaving in a year. But when other staff are seeing that level of investment, I think it helps with some of the things that people are talking about in the chat box. If you can't offer the highest salaries, like knowing that there's an environment where we're prioritizing the person and their goal ahead of their professional development goal ahead of the organizational outcome is not something that always happens, and so far has really paid off well.
What do you think nonprofits need to support talent justice? I mean, given that you're a nonprofit executive director, you've been running this organization for a long time, and you've had experience working in the field. Based on what we've talked about, what you've seen in the research, what thoughts do you have to share with us?
Yeah, I think nonprofits need to make some kind of commitment to this work, and just saying, like, even if it's something really small, what could be that is maybe not connected to a funding stream, like the fact that our fellows and career accelerators are all connected to an external mentor. Technically, I mean, you could talk about the staff time that goes into creating those relationships, but that is actually, the external mentors are volunteers. That's something we are able to access with our board and just our network of supporters to say who can help us to identify mentors. And so that's one place for nonprofits to make a commitment without a huge investment that can really go a long way. And I think for funders, it's recognizing how important this work is of talent justice in investing in staff and investing in growth and opportunities to move into leadership positions. And so for funders to really prioritize, recognize when there's a certain line in a budget that isn't actually extra or excess or something that's considered optional. I think of just recognizing the role that plays on the funding side would be really important.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the points that you said are so important. It's, it's about nonprofits as a sector prioritizing this issue and understanding the value that it would have for their organization and for the communities that they serve. There's one question, I'll just read it and we'll see what your thoughts are on it. What has your organization done to increase access to work or careers for the young people of color you serve in your organization or elsewhere?
Sorry, it was, what have we done to create
access to work and careers? And I think this is an important question, especially because what you shared, Jill, about the success you've had in having fellows that have gone through your program who've gone on to work in the nonprofit workforce, not just necessarily in your organization, but in other nonprofits, and also those who decided to pursue higher education.
Yeah, I think the fact that the fellowship is paid, so it's saying we believe that we can pay you for 20 hours a week, but where you're also really learning, you're not just performing a job. Like there's certainly responsibilities that you have and you're reporting to your supervisor, you're contributing to an overall goal, but that there's a significant amount of that 20 hours that's learning about nonprofit structure, it's learning about networking, it's thinking about their own career path and what kinds of barriers there might be and how can they overcome those. And so the fact that that's not, we would not have had the same cohort of young people if it was an unpaid opportunity. And so I think that's one way of really approaching the work and making sure that becomes, it's something that we don't currently have funding for, but we're finding a way to use general operating support because it's so crucial to this work.
Mm-hmm. So this question is for you, Sasanka. What are specific examples of how people have been prevented from accessing the nonprofit sector in your knowledge and your research and your experience?
Yeah. So the research indicates like a number of barriers, and a lot of them being related to those sort of like three buckets of recruitment, review, and requirements. But what we've been seeing a lot is it also falls on like organizational reputation around, culture as well. It's something that we didn't touch on today's webinar, but is in the toolkit and in the report, is how people view the organization's culture or how the culture is once they get there is a significant factor in whether or not people stay in the sector or want to apply for jobs in the sector. So I think that's a big one that we didn't touch on today in a lot of detail. I think those degree requirements, I've heard from a lot of nonprofits that they're actually more flexible than we imply. But I think people don't realize what a significant barrier it is to just list a bunch of really strenuous requirements that are actually more flexible, that, people don't know those things, right? Like, I think that if you go to like certain elite universities, they'll tell you, apply anyway, or we'll get you a connect or a contact at this organization. But that doesn't exist for a lot of people without institutional wealth or access to like strong social networks that are connected to the nonprofit sector. So I'd say like making things as simple as possible. It's advice that funders get given a lot for their grant applications. And I think nonprofits could take that advice to heart as well in simplifying their job application procedures.
Great, thanks, Sasanka. Jill, there's a question for you about what steps did you take or RHI take to roll out the Career Accelerator program in your organization?
So quickly, we started out by just doing some one-on-one interviews with staff to say where did they feel like there were barriers to advancement, having them, the goals that you saw on the slides earlier of what the Institute was about really came from the staff conversation. It was not like the board figured that out or senior leadership. It was through a series of conversations in trying to figure out what did people really need. And then a lot of the things that are in the toolkit came up. It was about people needed connections to mentors and a broader network. People needed access to higher education or going back to school that they just didn't have the financial resources to do. So we're really evolving this. This is the first year. We're in the we're at the 18-month mark of running Career Accelerator. So we're halfway through our second cohort, and we're only just now having the funding to be able to give people access to scholarships or paying off debt. So we're building it as we go. But if you're thinking about doing it, I think having someone at the organization lead a series of conversations with staff of just asking them beyond a typical like, how happy are you at your job, or what do you want to do? It's saying, what are barriers in really thinking where you want to be 10 years from now, and what would help you get there? And probably you'll hear a lot of the things that are in this toolkit. But then being able to say, how do we address those? Is it through mentorship? Is it raising funds for funds? Is it, in a couple cases for us, it was actually giving people paid time or switching up some of their responsibilities where they could try something that was a little bit different from their job description. So if we had someone who was on the operations team who said, I really feel like everyone who's doing youth development is having a lot of fun, and I think that I want to do that, it was a little bit of figuring out how can we free up a few hours of your time that you could test that out and see if that's something that you're interested in. If it's someone who says, I'm a middle manager, but I think one day I want to be an executive director, building in space for that person to start to do a funding visit or leading meetings, or kind of pulling them up and giving them increased responsibility so that they can start to experience that, have things to put on their resume. We often will forward job descriptions to people and say, this sounds like it's the kind of thing that you have said you want to do in the future. Look to see what's here. What would you not be able to do? Or if you were in an interview, what could you not speak to? And how could we potentially build some of that capacity in your current role? So the last thing I'll offer is that each staff member who's in Career Accelerator has an individual plan that they have created to meet their goals. It's not like a one size fits all. So the person who's in Career Accelerator who wants to get a PhD and like start a school has a different Career Accelerator plan than the person who wants to become a case manager at some point.
Right. Thank you for walking us through that, Jill. So the last question is to Sasanka. So for some benefits, and this will be our last question before we close out, for some of the benefits that you mentioned, like debt forgiveness, for example, is there a minimum amount of time that staff must have been working at the organization before the benefits kick in? What's the standard?
You know, that's a great question. And I think that the way that I've seen a lot of organizations do it is to make, you know, like a set minimum of benefits right from the beginning, and then have some that increase over time. And, you know, I think it really depends. So I worked at organizations that had like really generous like PTO, and I've worked with organizations, but that PTO did increase over time or had a rollover policy of some kind. And I think with benefits like debt forgiveness, a lot of people want to see some investment from the staff member, nonprofit professional, for a little bit before they invest in debt forgiveness. But I've also seen organizations that do employer matching right from the beginning. So it really, really does depend on your organization and what the capacity is, and you know, how good your operations person is at negotiating with benefits folks. So I think that it's a little more complicated. I don't know if there is a standard. I think this is something that from the people probably just a lot of work on, you know, it's like we don't have a lot of good established standards for what is adequate support in the nonprofit workforce. So great question. And I don't think there is a standard, but maybe there should be.
Thanks, Sasanka. And thanks, Jill, for joining us today and for sharing really important information about talent justice, sharing the research findings, but also sharing resources and an example with the Red Hook initiative about, a case study of one nonprofit that's really working toward making nonprofit work more equitable in terms of not just getting into the work, but also once you're in the sector, how you can be supported in order to stay in the sector and do your best work. So if you haven't seen the information in the chat box, you can access our report, our executive summary and toolkit at talentjustice.org. We have a few more webinars coming up this summer. Fund the People is busy this summer. So we'll focus on advancement in the nonprofit sector on July 9th, and then we'll have a final webinar in this series for talent justice to talk about ascension into executive leadership. And if you'd like to reach out to us after today's webinar, here are our email addresses. We'd be happy to talk with you offline and answer any questions you have about today's webinar. And thank you for joining us.